Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank you for joining us for this virtual event. What is a second edition, a pictorial introduction to bibliographical terms? My name is Ann Blecksmith. I'm the head of Reader Services here at the Huntington. This event is part of an ongoing library webinar series presented by Reader Services, now known as the Multi-Storied Library. As Ben mentioned, this presentation is being recorded and everyone attending today will receive an email with links to access this presentation later, as well as any resources mentioned throughout the presentation. Today we'll be discussing how printing technology developed from the hand press period to the early 20th century, how to spot different typesettings and impressions, and explore how basic bibliographical terms have been used by historians, publishers, catalogers, and booksellers. Illustrations include examples of varying quality, showing how photographic reproductions can produce false clues and digital red herrings. We hope this webinar will be useful for collectors, researchers who work with printed texts or digital copies of originals in the world's many open access digital libraries. I'm happy to introduce our curator of rare books, Steve Tabor, who specializes in materiality of the book, including bibliography, structure, printing history, provenance, binding, and annotation, with an emphasis on incunabula and English books printed before 1801. He is the principal Huntington liaison with 3 international bibliographical databases, the English Short Title Catalog, the Incunabula Short Title Catalog, and Material Evidence in Incunabula. He has published bibliographies of Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes, and co-authored with Tyrus Harmson a catalog of the work of the Los Angeles Plantin Press. He holds an MLS from the University of California, Los Angeles, and serves on the faculty of Rare Book School at the University of Virginia. Before Steve begins his presentation, I just wanted to let you know that we will also leave time at the end for a Q&A, which we'll be conducting in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. All right, it's time to get started, and I will turn over the virtual podium to my esteemed colleague, Steve Tabor.
Thanks very much, Ann. And I want to thank Jackie Becky as well as Ann for midwifing this talk. Without their encouragement, it wouldn't have happened. And thanks also to our producer, Ben Tuttle, for getting us on the air. Not too long ago, I got an email from a couple of friends, one a bookseller and one a collector. They were comparing 2 copies of Mary Austin's Land of Little Rain that looked very similar, but had some differences that seemed significant. To put it briefly, the title pages look the same. The copyright statements look the same. Notice that they both have a 9 with the end of the tail broken off, and the texts look the same. However, the marginal illustrations were printed in slightly different colors, and they didn't quite line up the same way with the text. The preliminary leaves had the same contents, but they weren't put together the same way. One version had a tipped-in leaf. My friends were wondering, first of all, how important these differences were, and secondly, how to characterize them in terms of a standard vocabulary. One of the books they were pretty sure was a first edition. Was the other a later edition or another sort of first? Was it a different issue, a separate printing, or a variant state? What did these words even mean, and what would the different choices look like? In the bibliography at the end of this webinar, I've listed some standard works that define these terms in various ways, sometimes in single sentences, sometimes in great detail. What is remarkable is that none of them contain a single illustration of what they're talking about. My purpose in this presentation is to explain the ways that bibliographers classify editions and impressions of printed books, and to show the visual evidence that helps them to do this. We'll learn how to detect different typesettings and how to identify, name, and assess the significance of variations within editions. This will not answer the question of whether that book on your shelf is a first edition or not. That's a trickier matter that may need access to reference books that most of us can't get at during this time of pandemic. In fact, as we'll see, there's not even agreement within the different segments of the book community on what first edition really means, and that's one of the problems I'll be addressing today. All literary works are Platonic entities. They only exist in our world of the senses in more or less imperfect versions that come down to us by reciting, writing, or printing them. In this talk, I'm only considering the typographic reproduction of works by printing. Every act of printing a work depends ultimately on a person or persons assembling the building blocks of the work, the letters and words, in a form that can be reproduced in multiple copies. This brings us quickly to the first of our definitions, and it's the most basic one. Setting is this act of composition, and it's also the product of this act of composition. It's the arrangement of graphic symbols that are to be reproduced. Today we do this on a keyboard, and the result is a computer file. But until the advent of large-scale mechanical typesetting around the 1890s, setting was done by moving pieces of lead type, about 1 letter per second, into a composing stick. The fact that it is handwork helps us to identify different settings. If you're composing lines of prose, as they have here, you have to manually insert spaces between the words to fill the lines to equal length, to justify them. And if you aspire to do what we call fine printing, you try to make the spaces optically even. When we're typing text into our computers, we don't even notice this anymore because the software takes care of it for us. Most modern books use justified lines with proportional spacing, which should result in a good overall gray type page with no irregularities to grab the eye. The printer Pat Ray taught me the trick of turning the page upside down to fine-tune the spacing so you don't get distracted and start reading. Before the 19th century, they did things differently. Here is typesetting from 1634. This printer was justifying his lines, but he wasn't worrying about proportional spacing. In the line with the arrow, for instance, you can see he was jamming in extra word spaces more or less at random until he got a tight line. Punctuation made an especially good shock absorber. You could add or subtract space on either side of it. There was little craftsmanship or system to this process, and no one would ever think about trying to do it the same way twice. That means that the characters in adjacent lines have a relationship that is unique to a given setting. Here are 2 copies of the same text. By the way, I won't apologize for the quality of the images I'm using. When you work on old books, you're often working on pictures of old books, and it's important to learn how to spot artifacts arising from the reproduction process. Are these the same setting? There are differences that look important and suggest maybe not. But in fact, these are all digital artifacts, complicated by differences in inking from copy to copy. It is common, especially in early English books online, where I got the top image, for parts of characters to drop out, or for letters on the back of the leaf to register as ink on the front and add their information to what you're trying to read. The important thing to look for is how adjacent letters align with each other, both vertically and horizontally, especially near the middle of the page where the differences will be greatest. For instance, the P in the word lamp seems a bit dropped, and the tail points to the space between the E and A below. These 2 pages show the same random spacing patterns. They are from the same setting. The worse the reproductions are that you're working with, the more important it becomes to look at the relative positions of the letters and filter out the background noise. Other points of comparison to watch for, if your reproductions are good enough, are broken, misshapen, or wrong font letters. Here, for instance, the bottom of the P has a missing serif on the right of its tail. The D has the top of its loop missing. The A has something weird at the bottom right that the other A's don't have. And the F has a little break just below the crossbar, harder to see in the bottom image, but if you know to look for it, then you see it's there. These are more ephemeral signs than the basic letter alignment, and they can disappear and reappear depending on differences between copies in inking, printing pressure, and transient glop that lands on the type and flies off again. Maybe one of your reproductions is too blobby to show the fine detail. For these reasons, finding just one of these random markers in both samples is strong evidence of setting identity, but a lack of correlation doesn't count very much against it. There is little probability of any of these markers falling at random in the same places twice. These tests will work even if your copies are distorted. I should say, as time went on, and especially as we get into the 19th century, printers paid more attention to even word spacing and tidy press work, and these tests get harder to apply. They can also be hard with early continental printing, where they took more pains with the fine points than they did in England. By contrast, here are two different settings, both from the same printer and both using the same damaged woodcut initial M. The line breaks are the same virtually throughout the book, so if that's all you're looking at, you might conclude the settings are the same. Line for line resettings are extremely common because it makes the composing job much easier in several ways if you compose them from a printed copy of a previous setting instead of a manuscript. But even though they didn't have to justify these lines of verse, everywhere you look, there are differences. Again, look how they handle spacing around punctuation. Now, because I studied this work, I can say that the compositor of the top version was almost certainly looking at a printed copy of the bottom version while setting his type, but there's no attempt to reproduce the fine points of word spacing. That level of detail was simply beyond their awareness. Some of you may know the old trick of drawing diagonals from the same points on different copies. If the pages are in the same setting as they are here, the lines should cut the letters at the same points, and you see in this case it works pretty well. There are two disadvantages to this method. The first is that you are not often in a situation where you can draw lines on old books or hold two rulers against two copies with four hands. The second is that if you are using reproductions of copies, you have no control over distortions. Here with these two pages, which I guarantee are in the same setting, except for a few little changes that we'll talk about in a minute, you might have doubts about the match in the circled areas. This is where the curvature of the two pages was most different when they were photographed. But if you apply the alignment test, you'll find that they are the same. You don't need any tools, and it's just as fast. We now come to our second definition. An edition is all of the copies printed from substantially the same setting of type. In the hand press period before about 1830, edition sizes generally ranged from a couple of hundred copies to 1,000 copies. We hardly ever know the exact number because the records don't survive. Now, when I say that I have a first edition of a particular work, the literal interpretation of that would be, I have all the copies printed from that setting in boxes in my garage. But what I actually mean is that I have one copy of the book in its first setting. But even that isn't unambiguous. Here at home, I have a copy of a famous Restoration play. My copy's on the left. If we apply our alignment test, it seems to be in the same setting as the Worcester College copy in Ebo. Are they the same edition? That's not what the printer of my copy thought. He is using the word edition to mean the 250 copies that he printed. But nobody recomposed the type to get from the Ebo copy to my copy. I just defined edition as all of the copies printed from a single setting of type. Philosophically, there's a case to be made that I have a copy of the first edition. But by claiming that, I would be making a fool of myself in almost any company. As with the word setting, the word edition can't always stand on its own without the support of more explanation. In this case, we can solve the problem by introducing a new level at a new term at a level below the edition. Pardon me. A printing or impression is all of the copies of an edition made in a single production phase. With the help of this definition, I can say I have the second printing of the first edition of Dryden's play. It just happens to be 250 years later than the first impression. Though my book was generated by a modern photomechanical process, no one reset the original type between the two printings. As long as books were printed directly from handset type, as here, an edition and a printing were usually the same thing. That means one setting, one printing, one group of books that all look more or less the same. If more copies were needed, the printer would have to reset the type. That's because most printers didn't own enough expensive type to keep the whole book set at once. At the small scale and cheap labor costs they were working with, that would actually have been more expensive. So they kept distributing the type after printing it, and by the time they reached the end of the job, the physical setting from the earlier part of the book had disappeared. Although I don't want to get into the minutiae of bookmaking today, it's important to know that most books weren't printed one page at a time, but in groups of pages that became sections of the book by folding. These folded sections are called quires or gatherings. One common format is shown here. We would call it a French fold or quarto, one sheet, 4 leaves, 8 pages. From the printer's standpoint, this was 2 separate steps. You print one side of the sheet and then the other, 4 pages and 4 pages. Other formats have different foldings, but however many pages they contain, these separate sides of a sheet are the basic production units of books to the present day. Here's another case where the words setting and edition on their own may draw us into confusion without more explanation. This 18th century book illustrates a case that wasn't that unusual. The first part shows up in 2 possible settings, but there's only one setting of the rest. What happened here is that around the time they were printing sheet H, they decided to raise the edition size. But by that time, the type from the earlier quires had already been distributed, so they had to go back and reset the type and print more copies of those quires to bring them up to the new edition size. This actually happened in the case of the Gutenberg Bible, the first large book ever printed in the West. So here you've got one edition in the sense of one group of copies printed for sale, but some of the quires come in 2 possible settings. The words edition and setting are both compromised here, and it's misleading to use either one by itself. You need to be specific about what's going on. The word reprint can also be confusing. The seller of an incunable from 1477 quotes the authoritative British Museum catalog, a page-for-page reprint of the edition of 1474. This doesn't mean the printers put the typesetting on a shelf and brought it back 3 years later for another impression. A clearer way to put this would have been a page-for-page resetting. But you'll see the word reprint all the time. For the early period, as here, it means a new setting, often typeset from a copy of an earlier setting. For modern books, it really does mean a reprint from the same setting. I'll talk about that process in a minute. During printing, another operation was going on, and that was proofreading. Today, authors usually get one chance to proof their book, and then it goes to press, and all the copies read the same. Not so in the hand press period before about 1830. Proofreading went concurrently with printing. The press might be stopped several times to make changes, and all the sheets of all the stages went into finished books because the paper was half of the cost of the edition and too expensive to throw away for the sake of a few errors. Readers expected to find some mistakes in their books. So we have another definition. A variant is one of multiple different readings found within a single printing. Variants are sometimes referred to as states, which include the original reading as well as the later variant ones. Sarah Werner, in her recent publication, Studying Early Printed Books, 1450 to 1800, has a good guideline. She says, it is helpful to think of states as consisting of those changes that the printer or publisher might not wish to call attention to. Here are a couple of pages we saw earlier, same setting, same printing. But these two states of the page contain 5 variants, changes made during a single interruption in the job to add commas and change spellings. And this was just one page of the book. For another page, the press was stopped 3 times to make changes for a total of 4 states of that page in the same printing. The tilde sign is a shorthand for a reading that stayed unaltered during that round of correction. We see that a whole book might contain a great many variants. Furthermore, the printed sheets, each sheet having 2 sides in different correction states, could potentially be assembled at random to make up the finished copies. So it's meaningless to take one particular variant as signifying an earlier copy of a whole book. There was no meaning in earlier or later until you get down to the level of one side of one sheet. I should add here that when publishers started issuing books in standard bindings, starting in the 19th century and continuing to the present, variants could also denote differences in the binding, different colors or stamping, or changes to the price on the dust wrapper. They were all part of the same package. Although single variants don't tell us anything about the priority of whole copies, they sometimes take on an exaggerated importance in descriptions by booksellers and bibliographers who don't understand what you do now. How many typos, or issues as this one calls them, issues are another beast entirely that we'll get into shortly. How many typos would you expect to find in the 2 thick volumes of Boswell's Johnson, and how important are they individually? Another example of hazy terminology that you see often is variant edition. Usually what the person means are not variants in the sense of corrections during printing, but instead they're entirely different settings. Presumably the copy offered here is a different setting from the one described in Roscoe's bibliography on John Newbery. But to call it a variant implies that it is some sort of version of the other edition. Either it's fundamentally the same setting or it's not. Even weirder is to call something the first edition of this edition. We can guess that this bookseller means it's the first printing of this edition, but like other features of this write-up, it makes one stop and wonder. So just to recapitulate a bit, for the hand press period, that is up to about 1830, we have this situation. A setting is created from which an edition is printed. The edition almost always consists of a single printing, which may contain multiple variants. If you sell out the edition, you make a new setting for a second edition, also printed once, with its own different set of variants. The 19th century introduced some new technologies that altered this picture in important ways. But before we get into that, I'd like to show some mechanical gadgets that can help you spot differences between copies, whether they be stop press corrections or entirely different settings. In our comparisons so far, we've been using what the bibliographer Randall McLeod calls the Wimbledon method. You put 2 copies side by side and keep looking back and forth. The gadgets, on the other hand, work by superimposing the two images and making the differences pop out. The grandmother of so-called collating machines is the Hinman collator. With this device, you insert two copies of the book and yourself and use a binocular viewer to combine the images. Then you alternate between them with blinking lights. We've got some jerkiness here courtesy of Zoom, but it's actually a very relaxing tick-tock. You change the blink rate with a knee lever. It's kind of fiddly to set up and get the images superimposed, but once you've done that, you can work through a text pretty quickly. Fewer than 60 of these machines were ever made, the last one in 1978. As of a 2002 census, 41 were still around, and some of those aren't usable now because of blown electronics or clouded optics. Hinmans are great for high volume collation, but like rare books themselves, you have to go to them, they won't come to you. What you see through the eyepieces looks like this. The keyword is in the middle at the bottom, and the correct spelling is ALS. The ethics of the business are such that the stockbroker should represent his principals, in other words, his clients. Since 1978, some other systems have been invented that depend on the principle of PLE of the autostereogram, which some of you will remember from their popularity a couple of decades ago. Unlike the Hinman, these work by sending slightly different images to the two eyes, and the brain manufactures a third dimension out of them, so any differences seem to pop out of the image. For autostereographic perception, you need two good eyes and some practice. So if you can't see a shark in this slide, these devices may not work for you. Nevertheless, here is one of them with its inventor, Randall McLeod. One of his eyes is looking straight at one copy of the book. The other is looking at another copy reflected in two mirrors. You don't need a moving crew to transport these newer inventions, and some of them even break down small enough to take on a plane with you. Finally, there is the smartphone app called the Pocket Hinman, invented by James Asher, a graduate student at the University of Virginia. This lets you take a picture of one page, then point your phone camera at the other copy, and the app will flip back and forth. The main challenge to using it is getting a steady superimposition, and for that you pretty much need a tripod or some other support for the phone. So, end of interlude, and back to the printing shop in our hand press paradigm of one setting, one printing. In the 18th century, several inventors figured out how to make clones of type pages, casts of the settings on solid metal plates that could be used for multiple printings without tying up the original type. Depending on the process, these were called stereotypes or electrotypes. Here's a section of an early stereotype plate. You can still see the individual types, but it's a single piece of metal. These page clones could be imposed on the press in the same way type pages could, but faster. The technology really got going in the early 19th century. The plates were lighter than type, and even lighter were the molds from which the plates were made. In either form, the setting could be transported to other plants or even other countries for casting and printing in multiple locations. Plating had its advantages and disadvantages. On the one hand, it was an extra investment that publishers would only make when there was a good chance of reprints. It was no longer a simple operation to fix typos during print runs. To make a change, you had to cut away the part of the plate containing the mistake and solder in a piece of metal bearing the correct text. Therefore, errors tended to persist through print runs and get fixed, if at all, between printings. But clearly, it was a good investment in the long term. In the 20th century, metal plates got replaced by offset plates made by photographing the original setting. The principle is the same. A single setting could be duplicated on as many sets of duplicate plates as needed. If you take any text after around 1830 and follow its printing history, you'll see the same setting being identified If you see the same setting being identified by the publisher as various printings, you can be sure that plates are involved. Publishers were often happy to identify reprints in the books themselves because it showed that a lot of people had bought the book. But they didn't always do this, or they didn't do it accurately. Here's an example in a book printed by offset lithography. For every reprinting, they've added a new line, probably on a printed slip pasted more or less carefully onto a master copy of that page that got rephotographed for each new impression. Note that they didn't make the corrections until the second reimpression, i.e. the third printing. With letterpress, where you can feel the impression of the type on the page, it's often not possible to look at a page of printing and tell whether it's from a plate or the original type. But type and plates behave in different ways. Printing from individual types, as here, tends to show damage to scattered letters, and we've already seen examples of these. Each letter has had its unique life. They've come together for this setting, and some of them had sad tales to tell. With plated books, we're all familiar with this look, which we tend to see in cheap reprints of standard texts. Worn out plates often show damage to groups of letters in the same area, especially near the edges of the type pages. These accidents occur usually during storage and retrieval of the plates between printings. Here's a delicious example of plated book behavior that I only noticed because an early reader made corrections. 2 lines in 2 different poems on the same page have swapped their last words. This is an eerie kind of teleportation that you'd never see in the hand press period, and here's how I think it happened. The affected lines are the 2 longest ones on the page. I think some accident damaged that side of the plate, and to repair it, they had to cut out the 2 words, reset them, and solder in the replacements. When they did this, though, they accidentally switched the words. It looks to me like the word glade is a little bit out of line, and the might be a bit tilted. I've been able to locate digital copies of 3 other printings from this setting, though there were probably at least 15 impressions in all. The 1861 and 1863 printings have the correct readings. The damage and the botched repair happened by the time of this 1888 printing, and the 1894 still looks like this. Nobody noticed or nobody bothered. You can see another plate repair in this example from earlier. Remember, the correct spelling is ALS. You could look at this flicker for a long time, noting different forms and wear of the types, but it looks to me like the last 2 lines and the page number were replaced in order to fix that one misspelling, and somehow the last line got misaligned. Although with plated books, the changes of state almost always happen between printings, you would still expect the readings to become more correct over time. This was not necessarily true. Publishers usually created duplicate sets of molds or plates. One was used for printing, the other was saved as a so-called mother, which served as a backup. The printing set might accumulate corrections or other changes like we've seen, and this continued until the set wore out. At this point, they went back to the mother and cloned her to make a new printing set. If memories were bad, the new set could go into production with the same mistakes as the first printing. Subsequent printings might have a combination of corrections different from many in the first set. Something like this actually happened with Babbitt, as Matthew Bruckley worked out in 1958. The self-described 4th printing, which is actually the 5th, is the most correct. There's our spelling of principals with the ALS, but the later reprints that introduced many of us to Sinclair Lewis's work were less correct. These were all the same edition, with 2 or more clones of the setting going down different paths. In the 20th century, with the spread of offset lithography, printing plates were made by photographic means and later by direct output from a computer file. Most modern books and your newspaper are printed by offset lithography. In the mid-century, you can see the process of transition from letterpress to offset. In 1967, Ted Hughes published his third poetry collection. This was printed from type or from a plate. I can't tell the difference, but it's letterpress, and you can feel the punch of the type on the page. Later the same year appeared what some people would call the first American edition, except it's not an American edition. It's mostly a photograph of the English edition printed by offset lithography, so you can't feel the type. The Americans were slightly ahead of the English in the transition to offset in the mid-century. When 4 years later, Faber decided to issue the book in paperback as a so-called Faber paper-covered edition, it also wasn't a new edition in the sense, in the bibliographical sense. Like the Harper printing, it was an offset litho reproduction of the original setting, but this one was reduced to fit the smaller format. The type image is not quite as sharp as the first printing on the left because it's a photographic copy. You could diagram the situation like this. There was only one setting, printed first as letterpress in England and later as offset litho on both sides of the Atlantic. When a publisher acquires a setting from an earlier publisher and uses it to print his own copies, as Harper did in this case, bibliographers call these copies a sub-edition. This is a term of art that you won't find in booksellers' catalogs and certainly not in publishers' ads, so don't worry about it too much. We now come to the trickiest of our definitions, issue. The word issue has been employed in so many different ways that it is essentially broken. Most people who use it, if you ask them what they really mean by it, they won't be able to tell you. The usage is a holdover from the craze earlier in the last century for so-called issue points. These were any sort of difference between rare books that proves that your copy was earlier than someone else's, making it more valuable. An issue point was a vague term for any of the distinctions I'm discussing today. In the mid-century, Fredson Bowers reined in the word issue with a crushing analysis covering many pages of his Principles of Bibliographical Description. Although the density of Bowers's treatment has limited its influence outside academia, the antiquarian book community has gotten more sophisticated on its own, and you don't hear much about issue points these days. So here is a simplified version of Bowers's more restricted definition. An issue is part of a printing with changes made for a different market or audience. Usually it refers to modifications carried out on the book as already manufactured, but there are exceptions to that. Even this definition needs a definition, so let's look at a couple of early examples. The first separate edition of a play by Ben Jonson appeared in 1620. Epicene was about as catchy a word in that day as it is now, and for those in the know, it also had a dangerous political association. For whatever reasons, the play appeared later the same year, retitled, without the reference to the first performance 11 years earlier, but adding the author's name, all seemingly good moves. But if you look beyond the title page, everything is the same. Copies with the new title show that the old title leaf was cut out and the new one pasted in. This is a second issue of the original sheets. We would say that Episene was reissued with a canceled title. A more common situation is shown by the Shakespeare second folio of 1632. Incidentally, we know this is the second setting/edition of this collection, but the publisher called it the second impression. Today, we would normally mean a reprint from the type of the first edition, which it is not, it's a new setting. This edition was financed by a consortium of 5 publishers, each of whom got his own imprint for his own copies to sell. In this case, there was no cancellation of the title page. The printer just stopped 4 times and reset the imprint. We would call these different issues of the second edition, though the alterations took place during printing. They're regarded as issues because the changes are major ones reflecting different distribution arrangements. In cases like this, I prefer to use the term imprint variants, which tells you exactly what's going on. If you see the same title issued by two or more publishers in the same year, odds are that they are the same printing with imprint variants or possibly canceled title pages. Some bibliographies may call them different editions, but that is wrong. And in this case, the error has the effect of doubling the apparent amount of printing that was going on. It's still one edition, one printing. Sometimes books get eaten by other books. William Fletcher's bookbinding in France first appeared in 1894 as the 10th installment of the monographic series, The Portfolio. This was one of that peculiar genre of early bookbinding histories that contained breathtakingly lifelike embossed chromolithographic plates, but not much textual value for us today. 3 years later, the same publisher brought out Fletcher's bookbinding in England and France. This consisted of a resetting, new printing of Fletcher's previous work on England, combined with leftover sheets of his France book. They cut out the title page and substituted this new divisional title. Everything after is the original sheets. This is the second issue of Fletcher's France book, same first printing. Then in 1905 appeared the France book on its own again from the same publisher, but with a new title page with the emblem printed in red. If you look down in the gutter behind the title, you'll see a stub. They've cut out the old title and pasted in the new one, and everything else is the same 1894 sheets. They're doing everything they can to move this dog out of the warehouse. The new title page does something I've never seen elsewhere. It identifies the book as a reissue, which is both bibliographically correct and completely honest, although they got the original date wrong by a year. Of course, the expected practice would be to pass off the old sheets as something different and new. If you're a buyer of books, it's good to be on guard against this, lest you find yourself buying the same thing twice. On the other hand, if you're delighted to have been fooled and you want to keep both copies, you're probably an advanced bibliomaniac and may want to seek professional help. We have now covered all the major terms of bibliographical classification. To recapitulate, an edition is all copies printed from a setting. A printing or impression is all copies of an edition manufactured in a single job. A variant is a small change made usually during printing or in the publisher's binding. And an issue is part of a printing characterized by changes made in sheets already printed, or it can be an alteration during printing that changes the marketing arrangement, like the publisher's name. With this in mind, let's revisit the original question that inspired this whole lecture regarding Mary Austin's Land of Little Rain. Remember that we had two copies that looked almost identical. The settings were the same, as we can now verify for ourselves using the alignment test and the broken types and various details. I will tell you that there are later printings identified as such in the books that also have this setting. So this is a book printed from plates, and we are looking at different impressions, issues, or states, not editions. The preliminary leaves contain the same text in the same setting, but the text is arranged on a different structure of folded leaves. To get from one to the other, you would have to rearrange the type pages on the press. This wasn't likely to occur during a single print run, and the motive would be obscure. In both copies, the illustrations are a different copy from a different color from the text. This is harder to see on the right. Given the technology at the time, this means that the illustrations had to be printed in a separate print run from the text. Further, in our two copies, the illustrations use different colors of ink, and they also align with the text a bit differently. This is not a situation where it made sense to stop the press partway through the printing of every sheet that had an illustration. It was equally unlikely that they switched out the illustrated sheets and put in new ones, creating new issues or states of a single printing. The only option left is that we have two separate jobs, two printings, not labeled as such by the publisher, but consistent with the same printing material being arranged on the press in two different layouts. One of the books, the one on the right, does indeed belong to the first printing, though the proof of that is more complicated than I can get into here. A bookseller who is aware of the difference might call that a first edition and would price the book much higher than the hidden second printing on the left. As far as I know, nobody has compared these two printings to see if the publisher made any textual changes between them. And the fact that there are two printings where people once thought there was one means the book was even more popular than we thought. So there are several kinds of value in play here, and our newfound knowledge of the taxonomic relationship between these two copies will help us ask the right questions going forward. We should now be in a position to use the basic terms of bibliography with some confidence. This confidence will increase with more knowledge of the printing technologies, which changed fundamentally over time, and I've only been able to allude to them briefly today. It bears repeating that the words themselves will often need explanatory support. The word issue, in particular, usually can't carry the weight of explanation on its own, and different states of a book are used to describe a broad range of variation from a single stop press correction up to and including complete resetting. For further reading, I have a couple of screens of references. Don't try to write these down now, but refer to the recording of this webinar that will shortly be available on the Huntington Library website. And I believe that those watching the live presentation will receive the list in an email. And my own email address is at the bottom. Please don't hesitate to use it. In addition to our producers, Jackie Becky and Ann Blecksmith, I'd like to thank James Asher and David Levy for their insights and suggestions. And thanks to all of you for coming with me this far, or at least for dropping in at the end to see how it all turned out.
Okay, thank you everyone. Thank you, Steve, and everyone for joining us into this deep dive this morning. I just wanted to mention that attendees at past webinars asked for a rare book talk on our feedback form, and we really hope we delivered today. We'll be moving to the question and answer portion of the presentation now. Feel free to list your questions in the Q&A box, and since we only have a few minutes left, we might not have time to get to all of your questions, but we will follow up with questioners after the talk. I'm also dropping a link here in the chat to our feedback form, and we would really appreciate if you took a minute to fill it out. So I will now take a look at questions that have come in. So let's see, we have a question, and I apologize if I don't pronounce this correctly. Are you familiar, Steve, are you familiar with the Traherne digital collator from Oxford?
No, I'm not, and I don't know what the principle would be. I will go and check that out afterwards.
Okay, great. Let's see. I will look and see. Let's see. We have some other questions coming in. Steve, what is your opinion of the Bill McBride points of issue that booksellers use? Also, the Ahern collected books.
I confess to not having, I'm not coming across very well here. I confess to not having read these. Again, there are different ways to define these terms depending on what culture you belong to. And I wouldn't be in a position to say that anything is right or wrong. It's just a different use. I've been trying to give the rigid bibliographical definitions here, but also to allow you to make your own judgment about what's going on.
Okay. I have another question that says, are you aware of any programs that let you store page images and compare copies the way the Hinman does?
I have seen people on occasion using computers in the reading room. I believe they have an image, their reference image on the screen, and are, using the two eyes to look at, compare with another copy. I don't know of an efficient way to do this. It's possible now, with things like IIIF and to get images onto your screen. But the process, if you try to superimpose them, that's the difficult part of using any of these devices. And if you're doing it with a computer, you find yourself enmeshed in some sort of Photoshop process that takes a long, long time. And by the time you finish the superimposition, you could have done it with your two eyes.
Okay, thank you, Steve. We got another new question. How can one actually differentiate order of impressions or variants? Is there a method to set a timeline, specifically in manual press?
In the hand press period, it's a much easier situation. And I worked on a book where over a series of resettings and reprintings and reimpressions, there were about 1,000 different variants. You do expect that errors will get corrected in a hand press book as long as we're in the same typesetting. And it turns out to be usually fairly easy to establish a sequence. Now, in the case of plated books, as we saw, there can be 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or 1 step forward and 2 steps back. And the question of Babbitt is still open, as I understand. The situation turns out to be much worse than Bruckley wrote up, and the case is still not settled.
Okay, we still have some questions coming in. Here's our next question. One of the real challenges in the collectible marketplace is to differentiate a true, real first edition against a modern reproduction that may be noted as a first edition. Do you find it easy to differentiate between a true first edition and any later copies?
Well, the possibilities are shown, possibilities for error are shown by the Galileo forgery recently, which was a facsimile of the first edition done by letterpress, baked in an oven and put in an old binding, and it fooled the experts for a while. However, normally a facsimile can't go to that amount of care and expense. It'll normally be an offset reproduction of a letterpress book. And with a little experience, you can tell that pretty quickly. There are ways to fake things up and do them better. The biggest difficulty I've found in the curatorial realm is trying to determine if a leaf is genuine or not in an old printed book of some value, where maybe something has gone missing and they've hired a pen facsimilist or a lithographer to drop in a copy. And that can sometimes be very, very difficult to distinguish.
All right. Here's a question. How accurate, comprehensive, or helpful is the ESTC in identifying editions, issues, variants, and such, especially with 18th century literature?
I have a disclosure. I worked for ESTC for 7 years and I'm still writing records for them and doing corrections. I think it's an extraordinary tool. Usually the case is one record per edition or per impression. In the later 18th century, you start getting reimpressions, or per imprint variant. So the fact of being a different record can mean different things. It's always being improved. There are a lot of ghost copies in there. The holdings are not as reliable as the bibliographical segments, but I'm able to take pride in my association with it, and I think it's an extraordinary tool.
Great. We'll take one last question. Thank you so very much for your talk. How might we understand the printing date of a book if it was issued by subscription over time and later bound by the owner subscriber rather than the publisher?
Well, bindings are a whole different issue, as it were. And rebinding is not really in the scope of this talk. Binding studies is a whole vast field in itself. If it was sold by subscription, it still falls under the rules of edition, impression, issue, and state. The mode of sale doesn't affect that. Now, there may be different binding lots, and that's something I haven't discussed here. For publishers' bindings, there's often a variety of colors or stamping that determine different states of the binding. But subscription books are no different in this regard than books sold in the normal way.
Okay, great. We're right at 11 o'clock. And so in the interest of ending on time, I'd like to thank Steve for generously sharing his knowledge of these processes with all of us today. And I hope everyone who attended had a great day, a great time, and we will be sharing this recording. It will be posted on our website. So tell your friends, there will be a second chance to view what is the second edition. Take care.